2024. But before you do that, I just want to remind you what you're talking about in as far as some of the highlights that are contained in that statement that was read by Professor Njuguna Ndungu, the Cabinet Secretary for the National Treasury, being the very first when it comes to the maiden budget of the Kenya Kwanza administration. And let's just get to it, because some of the figures that you're talking about is that it is a 3.7 trillion shilling budget. If you like, you can say 3.67 trillion. And of course, there will be some more money that will be spent for debt repayment or debt redemptions. We'll be getting to understand how that exactly means, because now, according to the documents of the National Treasury, the overall budget is 4.5 trillion shillings. But what has been accounted for in terms of the government expenditure is 3.7 trillion shillings. Then, in financing the budget, the government is hoping to collect ordinary revenue of up to 2.57 trillion shillings, majorly in the form of taxes, and then there will be appropriations in aid from the ministries and departments, that is 348.7 billion shillings. There will be grants of 42.2 billion shillings, and there will be borrowing, which is 718 billion shillings, and that is to take care of the deficit, which is now at 718 billion shillings. It continues to decline if you are to study the previous financial years, but they'll be borrowing up to 586.5 billion shillings from the domestic market and 131.5 billion shillings from the external market. Again, the external borrowing has been declining, but the domestic borrowing has also been going up over the years. And let's begin by posing the question to Honorable Ndindi Nyoro, the chairperson of the Budget and Appropriations Committee at the National Assembly. We look at this, and of course, there has been this explanation that the hope is to continue to reduce the deficit as much as possible, but the borrowing from the domestic market remains. Does it concern you, and how do we do it? Because there has been concerns, people saying the problem is not revenue, the problem is how much you're spending.
Thank you very much, Sam, for having us this evening. And was a very successful day for us, because we've been on marathon for the last several weeks trying to make the budget for the country. Mm-hmm. I agree with you that we are on a consolidation path where we are trying to reduce the amount of money that we are borrowing, because, as the president keeps saying, we don't want to continue digging the hole that we find ourselves in. And that is why, comparatively speaking, if you check around 2 years ago, our deficit in terms of, as a measure of GDP, was close to 8%, which then came down last financial year to around 6.2%. And in the supplementary budget, when we took over, we amended our budget and we took it down further to around 5.7%. We are currently at 4.4% of the GDP. If you check even in the aggregate figures, last financial year, what was on the books, what you could see in the budget was around 860 billion Kenya shillings in terms of the deficit.
Right.
But upon assuming the position we are currently serving, we realized after the peruse of government books that there was another expenditure of 200 billion shillings, which had been spent at an article we call 223. And therefore, the entire deficit for last financial year was actually 1.1 trillion Kenya shillings. We have been able to climb that down to around 718. We are still not at a very desirable level. And that is why we have benchmarks that we have set on ourselves to go even to just around 3.6%. The reason why the composition is more towards domestic more than external borrowing, first of all, how our debt is currently, the composition of our debt currently, as it is now, our country total debt portfolio is around 9.4 trillion Kenya shillings, which is around 50-50, that is domestic and foreign.
Right.
And it has been that way for quite some time. And actually, our benchmark was to remain around the same figures in terms of percentages.
Right.
But we are alive to the fact that Kenya is also part of the global economy. And currently, as we speak, and especially given what has been happening in the U.S., you know, what usually happens economically, when the U.S. economy coughs, majority of us now have to catch the cold. The Fed has been raising interest rate for 10 times in a row now, up to the current level of around 5.25%. That has had ramifications across the entire other economies in terms of capital flights and in terms of currency, and in terms of also jitters in the financial market globally. So we thought we are more in control of the domestic more than we are in terms of external.
Okay.
And that is why we have allocated much more borrowing domestically than exposing ourselves to the vagaries of external borrowing.
And I'll get back to you on that. Let me go to Dr. Rugo from International Budget Partnerships Kenya. When you look at that, because there's been this argument that if the government continues to borrow locally, you're shrinking the credit space for the private sector. Is that a fact, and is it something that we should be concerned about right now, knowing that the trend has been more and more borrowing is coming from the domestic market?
Yeah, I think it's a big concern. Because whereas borrowing locally would be encouraged in the kind of space where we are and the kind of economy we have, is that government is such a big player within the economy. And government is almost an assured creditor, perhaps decreasingly so. And for that reason, we seeing more and more, and you look at, like the last couple of years, especially when there was an interest rate capping, the government basically is competing in the same market with any other citizen or any other private player. And even when you look at the composition of the kind of profits that banks are registering, a lot of it is from the bonds and the bills that they have bought from government. Needless to say that a lot of this is also from money of the depositors, of the same people they are not giving credit, because they are saying these are risky. So it's a big risk. But the second bigger risk is even not so much. Yes, there's a competition with private sector, which I think is crowding out and affecting. But it's all the interest rates at which the government is borrowing from government. Is borrowing domestically at 14% on average for most of them. I think the last one was 15%. It should be a week or so ago. That rate already starts sending, and in fact, the greatest risk right now registered even by analysis from the Parliamentary Budget Office is that our domestic borrowing presents us with a very big risk. Right. Because in case of any inability of government to pay back, then the crash is local.
Right.
Yeah. So for me, I think those two have to be discussed, from one end.
Do you foresee a situation where the government is unable to pay domestic debt?
With the current interest rate, we are getting to a point where the government has only two options. It will get to a point where it will have to decide whether to pay to continue to provide public service. Let me give you an example. In the current financial year, in the budget that we are talking about, you've just presented the numbers there we are thinking of a spending of about 3.6. Collection of revenue, 2.5. The repayment of debt, both domestic and local, is 1.6. Bring it down. You collect 250, you spend 160 on debt. About 700 or thereabout of that is interest rate from the domestic market. So you're getting to a place where when you remove all those spendings, and if you add other expenses that we call mandatory expenses, you're talking of about 1.8 trillion, 180 shillings. So you're left with only 70 bob. If I'm using the example of 250 as terms of collection. Right. Remember, this 250 is a projection. It's not an assured amount. And therefore, it is going to get to a point where the government has to make a choice of whether to pay debt or to provide public services, especially with the volatility that is also happening in the external market in terms of commercial. And I think Ndindi has rightly said that the policy direction is to borrow locally. So the possibility of a default is not a very far-fetched idea. And I think the CS today said it perhaps more diplomatically, saying we are getting to the levels of distress. Levels of distress is simply saying, the way I'm breathing, I'm not quite, I'm not feeling very well. But saying, let me not see a doctor today, wacha nijisikilize. I might go tomorrow. I'm concerned about that because the reality is going to bite. And when you look at the expansionist budget that has been presented, I'm more concerned that the options are going to be very dire, especially because we have expanded the budget. We are hoping to collect more. The indications of the current financial year, and Ndindi can confirm this, are that we are likely not to even meet our targets.
Okay. And we'll get back to that because we have some statistics here. Wanjiru, when you look at this, and especially for the competition for resources in the domestic market, what does it mean, especially for Kenyans who are trying to go about their businesses in an economy that unemployment is high, the jobs that are there, they're not paying as people would want, the cost of living continues to go up. So what are the options with such an economy?
Options for who? For government or for the citizens?
Citizens.
Because the citizens have been told to tighten their belts. And, you know, I was watching the budget speech and thinking there's a bit of cynicism, quite a lot of cynicism, actually, when the kind of tax proposals are laid out. And given the economic situation, given the cost of living situation, you know, you then have the CS kind of, and even the chair, you know, the majority leader in parliament saying, you know, Kenyans have to tighten their belt, give the party time and all of that. The scenarios are difficult. They're difficult because the taxation is high, cost of living is high, the benefits and services that are coming from that are reducing. NHIF, in terms of the complement of you know, services you're able to get, have reduced. I mean, there are reasons behind that, as it's being streamlined. You're looking at cuts in the education sector. When you talk about tertiary level of education, you're talking about the cost of education. So in real terms, Kenyans are paying out a lot. The statistics tell us poverty has been deepening over the last 10 years. The statistics also tell us, and we can see, that food insecurity has also been increasing. Right. So what would we, and as Abraham said, there is a risk that we won't manage to hit that revenue target because of these economic times. Because, you know, on one hand, the government is saying there's a gloomy economic outlook, the GDP growth has been rationalized downwards, and then you expect to raise more. So what are the options for citizens? The option actually is really very much on government. And we would have wanted to see better prioritization. Instead of expanding and trying to ensure that manifesto promises are important. And I think the agenda that Kenya Kwanza put forward is also important about opening up the value chains, because that is how you transform the economy. Right. But when we look at the ceilings that they put, the allocations, for instance, to agriculture, the allocations to health, again, as Abraham said, the social spending has been capped. We would have expected to see a lot more going into agriculture, so that those small-scale farmers, county governments, have more money to be able to employ the workers they need, to be able to develop the infrastructure that's needed to create the transformation. So the scenario is dire, and we have a very good public participation process that's taken place. We have a budget process that has, you know, the PBO said is very transparent. Apart from a citizen budget, I think very good work was done in compliance. But listening to the real needs of the country and the people, that hasn't happened.
Okay. And for you, Alex, from CDH Kenya, when you look at, and the figures are there, which you look at, so the target 2.57 trillion shillings from ordinary revenue, I think the target for this financial year has been, is it 2.1? 2.1 trillion shillings.
1 trillion, yeah.
The target, as you say, is not certain that you'll hit it. When you look at the tax measures proposed by the minister, do you see the possibility of raising the revenue by about 400 billion shillings to hit 2.57?
I think it's ambitious, if I may call it, because let's go a little bit back. So 2022, 2023, 2.1 trillion. I think I was looking at the Kenya Gazette that was released sometime in May. And the government is at about 1.5 trillion in terms of tax revenue. As at end of March, we were at 1.4 trillion. So how many months? Actually, days. We have days to the end of the year. So basically they won't, I don't see them meeting that particular target. So come to 2023, 2024, and you have 2.5 trillion. will they actually meet it with the tax proposals? I think maybe not. There are some proposals there which could work. One example is the tax amnesty program, which I think will work for good reasons and for bad reasons at the same time, because then you have all these people who haven't been paying taxes, who have then been told, if you pay your taxes by June 2024, for actually all tax liabilities that fell due by 31st of December 2022, we forgive you for penalties and interest. So that's actually a good proposal that might bring some good money. Okay. Other than that, I don't see anything else actually bring the money. From a VAT perspective, though, I like the eTIMS, the electronic tax invoice management system, and the government forecast to collect tax real time so that you don't use their money to do anything else. So we've seen them speak about withholding tax and wanting to collect that within 5 days, as what Honorable Kuria and his team proposed. But the bill currently says actually 24 hours. So those are some of the good things that could actually bring in some tax revenue. But whether to get 2.5, I'm still not that optimistic.
Okay, and don't go away.